I'm Foster Markolf. I want to welcome the opportunity to talk about my love affair with Carpinteria. I was born in 1942, and when we lived in South Pasadena with my sister and my parents, so I'd say in 1946 or at the latest 47, we started coming to Carpinteria every summer like so many other people have done. Staying in the little beach bungalows that existed back then down on Sandyland. And my cousins also came down from Burlingame, and we stayed near one another every summer and had a great time on the beach, as everyone does who comes here, the world's safest beach, like John Wilbrandt's mural celebrates here in town now. So I've always had a real connection to Carpinteria. When my children were growing up, and I have two children, Derek and Carly, we lived in Pleasanton up north, and I would bring them down every year to stay at the campground, and we would have our vacations here. Unfortunately, I have very few pictures from back then because I later on got divorced from my first wife, and she still has all the pictures except for one, which I have of my son playing on the beach here in Carpinteria. But so we did that the whole time they were growing up. When I was a child, going backwards a minute.
May I ask what year you were born in?
1942, yeah, long time ago.
And today is November 19th, 2014.
Yes, it is. So I'll be 72 in a little less than a month. But among the things I remember is in particular the old beach store that used to be on at the foot of Linden, down there where Carpinteria Shores is now located. It was a old brown wooden building that sold jawbreakers and drinks and snow cones and all kinds of stuff. So it's funny the memories one has, but the main ones are, of course, of the beach and the companionship with the family, although I probably didn't identify it as such in those young years.
Well, what family members were with you?
Father, mother, my sister Martha, myself, and then my cousins Judy, Crick, and John, who were the children of my father's only sister. And they lived, as I said, up in Burlingame and would come down for the summers as well. Then, so as I said, we had all our vacations here with my children as well when they were growing up. And then in about 1984 or 5, we bought a condo on Linden at not Carpinteria Shores, but at Sunset Shores. It's one of the upstairs efficiency units. It's got a balcony that looks across at Linden Field and the campgrounds and over, fortunately, to the ocean as well. So my dream by the time I was in college, and beyond that probably a few years, was to see if I could find a way, again, like so many other people have been desirous of doing, of ultimately living here, retiring here. For me, it ended up being basically retirement. And I met my current wife, Rosa, in 1989, and one of the first things I asked her to do was to accompany me down here to see, so I could show her Carpinteria, and hopefully she would fall in love with it as I had. And we stayed at Carpinteria Shores for a few days in one of the condos upstairs there overlooking the beach, and spent a lot of time just walking around town and giving her an opportunity to get to know it. And fortunately, she too fell in love with Carpinteria. So then a year or so later, we started looking for a property to buy here. And ultimately, or rather not ultimately, but originally we bought a place over on Vallecito we used Zahid Sadiq as our realtor, and he became a good friend, which will be evident more in a minute when I explain what he did for us. We made a deposit on a property there, and it was going through escrow. Fortunately, it had some contingencies, but he knew we always wanted to live by the beach, as close to the beach as we could get. And he called me up in Santa Clara one day and said, there's a place on 3rd Street that's in foreclosure and you might want to look into that. He did this even though he would lose his sale on this other property. So he's really a guy with high integrity. So what ultimately ended up happening is I researched this property that we're sitting in doing this interview today on 3rd Street, and found out that I think it was June Lamb and her husband had owned this property back then, and it was a 2-story, 60-year-old wooden structure that had been subdivided into all kinds of sleeping units for migrant farm workers. In fact, the back end of the property had been condemned by the city and fenced off, and there was broken bicycles and refrigerators and all kinds of junk back there. They had built 2 more shacks on the property and put sleeping platforms in there that they rented to migrant farm workers for $100 a week or something like that. They'd owned the property next door on the corner of Holly and 3rd as well and done similar. We were told, up to 40 or 50 people living here at a time. They had sold the property to someone else, taken back a second of $100,000, and then something happened. I think the owner of the property died and they were unable to make the payments, so it went into foreclosure. There was a little bit of taxes owed on the property, but not much. I went to the courthouse. Actually, Brad Stein was there because he was in construction at that time. A contractor, built a place across the street, actually. That's where I first met him. And 14 people showed up for the foreclosure sale, and I had these cashier's checks for the amount of the first mortgage and additional increments in case I needed them. Of the 14 people, though, nobody bid but me, so we were very lucky. I drove down from Northern California that morning. Zahid went with me to the sale. We succeeded in getting the property, paid off the property taxes, drove back that night. Sadiq and his real estate firm had foregone their commission on the other property, which we were able to get out of, but Rosa and I agreed that the right thing to do was to pay them the commission they would have otherwise earned on that, and we did that as thanks for what he had done for us. We had never seen the inside of the building that was here, or for that matter, any of the property, other than from what we could see from outdoors. When it was inspected, it was a complete disaster and had to be torn down, which turned out to be beneficial for us. And we began interviewing architects, and this was back in 1991. And we found Anthony Spann eventually and hired him to design the home that we're now living in. And it took about 1.5 years to build. And we've been living here full-time for 18 years. We're neophytes in Carpinteria, having lived here only 18 years. But we're so happy and so fortunate to have been able to move here. When I retired, and well, actually when we started living here, I telecommuted with my last company for 2 years. I went up to Santa Clara every Tuesday in the morning, flying out of Santa Barbara to San Jose, and then flew back in the evening, and did that for 2 years. And then the company was sold, and I retired in about the third quarter of 1999. So I neglected to mention that when we bought the property back in 1991 at the foreclosure sale, I think there was $202,000 or $203,000 owing on the first mortgage. So that's what the property basically cost us, plus around $3,000 in past taxes. The interesting thing about the second mortgage that I think it was June Lamb held on the property was it was a $100,000 mortgage, and she came to the foreclosure sale because she knew she was going to, if someone bid successfully on the property, they would lose their $100,000. And when she came there, I didn't know who she was, but she came up to me and took a picture, Polaroid picture, on the top of this page. And that's me with a surprised expression on my face. and I said to her, not knowing who she was, why are you taking my picture, or something similar to that? And she said, well, you're the guy from the bank, aren't you? And I said, no, I don't have anything to do with the bank. And she said, oh, okay. And she took the picture out and gave it to me. So what I showed you is we have a before and after binder of pictures of what the house looked like when we bought it, and during construction, and when it was done, which we put together for the Carpinteria Beautiful Home and Garden Tour, which we've been fortunate enough to have been in twice now. So let me talk a little bit about our immersion into Carpinteria, which we were so happy to have the good fortune to be able to do. One of the first things we did was, many people will remember that there was a 2020 visioning project that the city of Carpinteria put on. I can't really remember the year, but it must have been in the early 90s, 92, 93, 94, I don't really remember. But Rosa and I both, to get to know people and to get to know more about the community, we signed up for that, and we participated in we were on the arts, I think it was called the Arts and Recreation Committee. Matt Roberts was the city representative on our committee. And so what we were trying to do was try to envision things that we would like to see done in Carpinteria by the year 2020. There was all kinds of different committees, of course. The thing that we worked on in particular and wrote a short paper on was we thought it would be nice to establish a replica of a Chumash village, or part of a Chumash village here in town, and actually envisioned it being somewhere, if not tar pits, which is on the state campground, so probably wouldn't have been too likely, but on Linden Field, which now, as it turns out, as everybody knows, the Tomall Park is there, and it's kind of a playground version of a Chumash village. So that was a really great experience for us, and we got to know a number of people in town who have become good friends. Since that time, Rosa's been involved with the Arts Council. She's an artist, and she paints and makes jewelry and sews, and so she's had some things in their gallery there, and she's helped them from time to time, and is talking now with the director there, Sherry, about getting more involved in the Arts Council. I've been involved, in fact, we've both been involved with Carpinteria Beautiful for, I don't know, 15 years or so at least now. I've been on the board of Carpinteria Beautiful ever since we formed the board about 8 or 10 years ago. I was the president of Carpinteria Beautiful for a couple years, about 5 or 6 years ago, and a vice president now. I'm a lawyer by background, so I handle what minimal amount of legal questions that come up there also. And we love our association with Carpinteria Beautiful, the motto of which, if you don't know, but most of you do, is clean, green, and beautiful. About 8 years ago, we formed a murals committee. Carpinteria Beautiful had done the tile murals near the seal fountain and at the corner there in the past, but we thought it would be nice to do a couple of painted murals in town. And we started talking to John Wilbrandt about whether we could interest him in doing a mural. The thought was to have a theme of World's Safest Beach, and he was very interested and came and met with us, and we were establishing how to go about getting that done when he got some huge commission to work on down in Westlake. And that deferred the project by a couple of years. So to fill in that, we heard that Whitney Brooks Abbott had painted this large painting looking towards Rincon, which was hanging in the Kilovac building. Her husband Murray worked there at the time as an engineer, and it was in basically a break room or something in there on the wall. And we talked, but the company had asked them to remove it. So anyhow, to make this story a little shorter, we worked with Whitney and the city and the Architectural Review Board to get permission to hang, and Verna Carter, the owner of the property, to be able to get that mural mounted on the Kelovac building where it's been now for the last 6 years or so. That was an interesting project because it had to go through the ARB, and we had to design, since it's an already painted mural, we had to design a hanging system for it, which we worked with the Santa Barbara Art Museum. They'd done some of that before. And so ultimately we got that hung, and it's been there, as I said, for about 6 years now, and we keep maintaining it. It gets a lot of attention. About this time, John had finished his project down in Westlake, and so we started working with him to get the world's safest beach mural painted. I stayed after him for a good 6 years before he finally started painting. Bless his soul. And then he just had the most wonderful time painting that, because all these people he knew when he was growing up here in Carpinteria, where he established, among other things, the first art gallery, which is kind of an outdoor cubicle he had over in that vicinity. It's actually where the Tory Gate shops where soap is. In there he had the first, everyone thinks to be the first gallery, art gallery in Carpinteria. As he was painting the mural, though, it went on a little bit longer than he anticipated, because people would stop him, lots of people, every day, and want to talk to him about his past. And the mural turned out, of course, I'm more than a little biased on this subject, but it's really a wonderful addition, I think, to Carpinteria. We had to go around and talk to all the property owners, particularly the ones in that building, which, by the way, was the first branch library in the state of California, was in that. It used to be called the Masonic Building. I'm not sure what it's called now. But we ultimately got everybody to agree that it would be a good addition. And we went again to the Architectural Review Board, and they had some questions, and they approved it. And it was painted, and it was finished in July of 2012. So it's a little over, well, nearly 2.5 years it's been there now. And there's a nice plaque that we bought that's there, that when we dedicated the mural, we closed off that parking lot between Robitaille's and Señor Frog's, and actually over 200 people came to the dedication, so it was kind of nice. And we had this big cake from Rinaldo's, and John cut it, and everybody had a good time. John is an internationally, for those of you who don't know, an internationally known muralist. He's done huge murals on buildings, for example, in San Francisco, inside and buildings and big hotels and resorts in Hawaii. And although we knew him as a local artist and as a friend, knowing his reputation and knowing that he grew up here in Carpinteria, we wanted him to paint this mural. So, as I said earlier, he was receptive to that, and we worked with him to get that accomplished. And so when we finally got to the point of the mural being designed and then painted, John went away, in his creative way, he developed a rendering of what it would look like, done to scale, and he used as the center point of that, and ultimately of the mural, this postcard. So John took as the center point of the mural this postcard that was done many, many years ago. It has Lou and Susie Panizon and their 2 children on the beach in Carpinteria with, as you can see, an umbrella that says Carpinteria, World's Safest Beach. So there's the whole thrust of the mural, is trying to design a image that will portray to everybody who comes and visits, as well as to all our, I'm going to put this down now, to all our residents, this great background we have for our beach here. I don't think I've mentioned up until now, but John is the son of Mary and Ernie Wilbrandt. Ernie was involved very heavily in the first city governments and city councils we had here, and was, I believe he might have been the first mayor of Carpinteria, but he was certainly our mayor for some period of time. And the whole, I guess for those of you who don't know the background on the world's safest beach thing, it's, for one, you can go to the mural and read the plaque because it talks about the background. But it started back when the state beach camp wasn't called the campground at first, and it wasn't a state beach. It was like Harvey Fish Campground or something.
Henry Fish, yeah.
Yeah, I think campground, something like that. I don't remember the actual name. And they came up with a slogan to get people to come there that evolved into World's Safest Beach. And of course, it is a safe beach because of the Channel Islands, and there's no riptides, or the sea is very, very safe. So, pause.
Okay.
There was,
Tell me when you're ready.
yeah, go.
Stand by and go ahead.
So one of the things we did, John and I, when we were talking about his doing this mural for us, one of the first things we did is we went to the local historical museum and looked through all the photographs they had there to find what we knew had existed, photos of the use of the World's Safest Beach logo in the past. For example, on my wall to your right is a picture of a building. I think it was a Safeway Market behind the Rexall Drug that was on Carpinteria Avenue. And on the top of that building is a big sign that stood up on top of the roof that says World's Safest Beach. And there was also a water tower across the street from there, somewhere in the vicinity of Linden and Carp Avenue, that stood on the top of this building that had a huge World's Safest Beach sign on it. And there was a billboard on Old El Camino, or the beginning of 101, that was a welcome to Carpinteria, World's Safest Beach. So there's a lot of history with this imagery and with this name. So for those of you who may not have yet seen the mural, and again, it's on the building opposite Robitaille's, where Senior Frog's good Mexican restaurant is. This is the image of the mural. It's available on postcards. I think they have them at the Historical Museum.
Okay.
So then other involvement that we've had here, Rosa and I, and Carpinteria, has been, I guess I mentioned Carpinteria Beautiful. I've been with the Friends of the Library now for 5.5 years. It's another wonderful nonprofit organization here in town. The sole purpose of our existence, and we've been around for 47 years now, is to raise money to help our wonderful local library, where Tara O'Reilly is the supervisor and has been for 18 years and does a wonderful job there to help them stay in business, because as many of you know, but perhaps a lot of you don't know, about 5 years ago now, the state of California stopped providing any funding to the libraries here in the state. And about that time, when we were having that 2008 recession, the county of Santa Barbara, which provides the principal funding for our library, cut their funding by 15%. And our city, which provides help to the funding of the library, at that time was not providing a tremendous amount of financial support, although in the last couple of years they've been gangbusters and helped out a lot. But the Friends of the Library, anyhow, is one of the principal providers of funds, and our hours in our library had dropped fairly drastically, but we ran I was a president of the Friends of the Library for 3 years, and during that time, our board ran a Save Our Library campaign in town, and our citizenry just came forth and opened their pockets, and we had community meetings to garner interest, and we ran stories in the Coastal Valley News, and we were able to raise enough money to keep the library open, not only to keep it open the number of hours that it had been open prior to the almost need to cut back to 26 hours a week, which would have been very dismal. But we've been closed on Mondays here in our library for about 2 years at that point, and we raised enough money to reopen the library on Mondays as well. So that's been I've spent a lot of enjoyable time with the Friends of the Library. Gene Baylord is our president now. I'm the vice president, and we have a very active board, and we have the bookstore, of course. Thanks to the generosity of the city, the Seaside building that the city owns, where they recently completed Seaside Park. So the city's given us very favorable rent, and that's enabled us, that's assisted us in raising the money that we raise from the sale. Every book in that store is donated by not only local people, but people who come here from out of town often bring books with them to give to our bookstore. And every hour of time that's spent in that store, running the store, is dedicated by volunteers who run that store and keep it open when it's open.
So for those that ask how our library is relevant today, what would you say?
Well, that's one of the fundamental questions in our society today, because, as we all know, of the emergence of electronic books. And interestingly enough, though, the traffic in our library has, if anything, picked up the last couple of years. And the reason why is the library is turning more into a community center type of place. I mean, one of the things we did is the Friends bought some new computers for our branch library a few years ago. And of course, there's people lined up there every morning before the library opens at 10 to get in there to sign up for those computers. You can also get electronic books through the library system. So the interesting question is, to what extent is the business of a library, at least in our county and in our city, consist of checking out books and checking in books compared to what it was a decade ago? And certainly it's less, but it's still a pretty big part of what they do. So a fair question to ask is, how long will is there a drop dead point for libraries? And I don't know of anyone who seriously thought of that question who says that they think that libraries are going to disappear, because people's thirst for knowledge and need to have a place to go to fulfill that thirst for knowledge. Sure, they can get a lot of it through Google, and they can get a lot of it otherwise through their computers and through these electronic books, but we haven't seen very little drop off in our business, for example, at our bookstore that, as I've said, we use to financially support our local library. People are still buying books every day. We're beating our budget every year for the sale of books. So yes, it's going to drop off. To what extent and how quickly, I'm not smart enough to know for sure. But I think we're going to all be surprised that libraries are going to be relevant in our lives for longer than some people might think at this juncture. If I could go back a minute, one of the things that Carpinteria Beautiful did that I didn't mention, and I don't know how it slipped my mind exactly, was, okay, so in Carpinteria Beautiful we do a lot of things. We plant trees, we plant gardens, we remove graffiti, we do the murals that I mentioned, we do Christmas trees at the Seal Fountain every year, lots of different things. One of the things we do is we have 60 or so people, most of whom are members of Carpinteria Beautiful, but many of whom are just what we call adopt-a-spotters. Adopt-a-spotters are people who pick up trash in town, and they have designated areas that they're responsible for picking up trash. For example, I do the 8 square blocks in the beach area here, and have for the last 11 or 12 years. We started this about 12 years ago or so, maybe 11. Before that, we had 2 or 3 times a year we would have community trash pickup days. Why do I mention that? Because we realized that the main thing that we pick up, the 60 of us, every single week is cigarette butts. And so we got to talking about that, and someone mentioned, it was Sylvia actually, the code compliance officer for the city of Carpinteria, mentioned that she'd heard of a ordinance that the city of Calabasas passed, and I started looking into that and found out that in March of 2006, they were the first city in the United States to become basically a smoke-free city. They enacted an ordinance that said in public places and private places visited by the public, there was no smoking in their town. No smoking on streets, no smoking on sidewalks, as well as restaurants, businesses, etc. We decided at Carpinteria Beautiful, in order to try to get the number of cigarette butts that we had to pick up reduced, to see if our city would be interested in doing that. And on behalf of Carpinteria Beautiful, I wrote a letter in August or September of 2009 to our wonderful city manager, Dave Derflinger, explaining the background of Calabasas and the problems with secondhand smoke. It's actually called a comprehensive secondhand smoke reduction measure. And so I wrote this 3-page letter to Dave, and he got his staff involved, and we started meeting with them in early 2010, and worked with Don Dunn, who's the tobacco prevention director for the County of Santa Barbara's Health Department, and I worked together for 14 months with the city. We met with the Avocado Control Board, with the Chamber of Commerce. We toured the city and met with business people in the city, trying to educate them about what this would involve, because restaurants, for example, whose patrons smoke a lot, could be expected to not be open-armed about such an ordinance. We had 1 or 2 community meetings, and then we made presentations to the city council, and ultimately it was in February of 2011 our secondhand smoke compliance ordinance was passed here in Carpinteria. We became the 4th or 5th city in the state to have an ordinance which basically precludes smoking in all public places in the city of Carpinteria. Our principal focus, because as Carpinteria Beautiful, was to, as I said earlier, to get streets and sidewalks included, hoping that the number of butts that then we were confronted with when we went out to pick up trash was reduced. And it has been reduced some, but there's still a lot of cigarette butts out there. So the city ultimately approved the ordinance, and it had a 90-day gestation period, or whatever it's called, and went into effect in the middle of May of 2011. So it's been almost it's been 3.5 years now.
And what was the reaction from businesses in the community, would you say?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, when we had the community meeting, and Steve Goja, the senior planner for the city, and Don and I made presentations, and we took questions and for a little over an hour. And there were people largely from the business community, and Chamber of Commerce people were there. And by that time, we'd met with most of them, and I think we'd successfully responded to their concerns about it. There were very few questions even at that meeting. I'm going to get back to your question more in just a minute, Larry. Then when the presentations were made to the city council, there was at least 2 meetings. I think there was a preliminary approval, and then waiting till the next meeting, or the meeting after that even, not sure. when they finally approved it all together. And when people spoke, we had people come from Calabasas, from San Luis Obispo, which city had also enacted such an ordinance. We had a representative from one of the state agencies, all came and spoke in favor of the legislation. There wasn't a single person in the audience, somewhat pleasingly and surprisingly, who got up and spoke against it. But we still realized that it would, so now it's been passed, and now we're saying, what do we do to get it properly implemented? Well, one of the things Calabasas did was they closed down their whole planning department for several days, and everybody in their planning department and some other people who worked for the city went out with brochures and information about the new ordinance and visited every single business in Calabasas. Our city staff was not equipped to be able to do that, so instead what we did is we did it ourselves. Don Dunn had an arrangement with the Boys, and I always get the Girls Inc. and the Boys and Girls Club confused. I think it was Girls Inc. where there actually, okay, I'll back up even a minute further. When we first started launching this thing, the first thing we realized we had to do was educate the city council members and get their input on what they were looking for and see what they gauge their interest in such an ordinance. And so I scheduled meetings individually with each of the city council members, and at each meeting we had a representative of Girls Inc. there, a teenage girl, to represent the teenage view of this. And they were all very supportive of this as well. And we both met with each of our city council members at the time, and all of them were favorably disposed towards doing this. And then we had a second meeting with them within a month or two before the vote was going to take place. The same duo, myself and a representative from Girls Inc. So it was a representative of Girls Inc. and Dawn, or one of the people from her department, and myself at the beginning went around with window decals and and brochures, and met basically with every business in town, at least all, not the manufacturing places or the office buildings on the outside of town, but all the ones in what we call the T area, restaurants and retail businesses and banks and everything. Went and met with them and explained what was happening to them and tried to encourage them to put one of these window stickers. I'm looking for my sign over there because I have a copy of the sign that's up around town, but basically it says a Carpinteria, a smoke-free city, clean, green, and beautiful, or something like that. They're all over town. That was the other thing. Another thing we did is working with Steve in the planning department. We had these metal signs made up that are a duplicate of the window decals, and there's probably at least 30 of them up around town now, including on each of the lifeguard towers down by the beach, at the swimming pool, at the Veterans Building, all the major intersections. That was the way we tried to educate the community. And we've had fairly good, we've had excellent adherence to the law. There's, of course, you always see, not always, but often see someone smoking in town. More often than not, they're visitors. And sometimes we say something to people to try to educate them. Other times we just, I guess, let it go. But that's really all I have to say about that, unless you want to pose another question.
So the businesses haven't particularly objected?
No, we had a problem with one business. It took about a year of, it was a restaurant in town that has a very heavy clientele, good clientele, lots of business, and their people are used to, since you can't smoke inside, they're used to going out on the sidewalk and smoking in front of this business. And we had to work assiduously with the management of that business to try to educate their own patrons not to do that. They ultimately put up one of these no smoking signs right on their door, and there's one on the light pole at their intersection. But I would go by there for the first year on my walks. I walk around town all the time. And I'd sometimes pick up 60 or 70 cigarette butts on their sidewalks. They're on a corner, so. But ultimately, and the city ultimately wrote them a letter and asked them to stop allowing, it's a kind of a dicey issue because they can't really tell their customers what they can and cannot do, but they can influence them, and they can educate them, and ultimately they did. It took longer than we would have liked, but Calabasas had similar problems. They had 2 or 3 people who just wouldn't adhere to the law until they had to give out fairly heavy fines to at least 2 of their businesses. We never got to the point of having to do that here, so everything worked out fine. I'm rambling a lot here. What this all boils down to is my wife Rosa and I are so fortunate, so happy to have had the opportunity to move here and live with all the wonderful people who live here and get involved in the community. We're fortunate enough to be retired, and therefore we're able to do these types of things with nonprofit organizations here in town that try to make our town a better place to live in. And we have, what little we've done very happily and enjoyed every minute of it, and look forward to another 40 or 50 years here in Carpinteria.
Foster, one last question, if I may. How do you see the future of Carpinteria, or how have things changed in your time?
Well, yes, thanks for asking me that. Let me start with when we first started, Rosa and I, right before we moved here full time, say 18 or 20 years ago. We came at a time when the community had faced the prospect of a big box center, maybe even a Costco in particular, being built on the bluffs. And that was when Donna Jordan and Mike Ledbetter and Brad Stein, I think we came right after they had first run as a slate to try to do everything they could do to preserve our community the way most everyone who lives here likes to see it, a small beach community. It still is a small beach community. Doesn't look like the way it did when I first started coming here in 1947 or whenever it was, but it looks a lot like that, surprisingly more like that than most people would ever think would be possible. And when we moved here, as I said, one of the first things we did was get involved in that 2020 visioning thing, which was looking into what types of things we could do to preserve our town going forward. And we're still, 5-6 years from 2020. I don't know what's going on with that visioning thing and whether anyone's looking back into what we all discussed back then and what's been accomplished or not accomplished that we all agreed would be nice to have accomplished. But that's a question for someone at the city, I guess. And then shortly after that, we saw the very successful effort to save the bluffs that was run by what is now the Save the Bluffs Foundation and Board of Directors. And I mean, that was really incredible, and it was such a terrific example of the way this town comes together for things. Kids gave pennies, literally, and dimes and nickels, and everybody, or such a huge percentage of people contributed the financial wherewithal in response to that effort that, as presumably pretty much everybody knows now, enabled the community to buy the bluffs and save them, and now they're saved forever. And if you haven't seen the wonderful bronze sculpture that's there that lists a lot of the primary donors, it's right there at the end of Baylord at the entrance to the trails that meander through the bluffs. You should go see it. It's kind of cool. Now, I haven't got anywhere near to answering your question yet. It's obviously impossible to predict, but there seems to be a very universal feeling of people who live here of wanting to continue to do everything humanly possible to preserve the type of town that we're all so fortunate to be able to live in. And I don't see anything myself that leads me to believe that that's not possible. I think that as long as we're able to succeed in electing people to our city council, and as long as we're able to continue to have an outstanding city manager and his incredible staff devoted to seeing that our community stays, it continues to grow in many ways, but stays substantially the same as it is, as long as the State Beach Park continues to occupy the real estate they have and preserve that part of our coast, I'm very, very optimistic that this place is going to be a fantastic place to live and grow up for as far into the future as it's possible for me to fathom. Thanks, Larry, very much for giving me the opportunity, and you and your Everyone Has a Story effort is just incredible. We've been doing a little work with you at the Friends of the Library, and we're very happy to be associated with your effort and wish you the best of luck going forward.
Thank you, and thanks for all the good work you've done in the community.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Larry.